Okay. Thank you for that prayer. Well, I'm glad to be with you. This is my first time to be at Eastern Meadows to speak. And so, David, thank you for the invitation and that introduction. But I'm grateful to be here. Look forward to our conversation here tonight. What the church needs, members who are good fathers and mothers, husbands and wives. That title reminded me of an event several years ago when a colleague of mine died suddenly. And he was a good and godly man in his own right. And shortly after he passed, I walked into his office and there was the writing hanging on the wall that said, "The greatest want of the world." It's like what the church needs. Well, let's think a little bigger. What's the greatest want of the world? I don't know about you, but it sounds kind of like one of those questions they would ask at a beauty pageant, right? What's the greatest want of the world? And you know what the answer would be.
World peace.
World peace. That's always the answer at a beauty pageant. The greatest want of the world. But the writing, which now hangs in my office, went on to say the greatest want of the world is the want of godly men. And as I began to think about that and ponder world peace, it occurred to me that yes, indeed, we have the answer to world peace. If you want world peace, we need more godly men. If righteousness exalts a nation and you want a nation that exalts righteousness, we need more what? Godly men. If you want a community where it's safe for children to walk home by themselves, we need more godly men. If we want more powerful churches that are influential within the community, we need more godly men. If you want stronger marriages that will last a lifetime, we need more godly men. If we want children who are well adjusted and stable and young people of faith, we need what? More good and godly men, good husbands, good fathers. There's one thing I know about men. Your influence will never be neutral. I believe we need to challenge men to raise the bar, the level of expectation for themselves as husbands and fathers, because I'm confident of this, your influence will not be neutral. You have it within you to capture the hearts of your wife and children in a way that you can be an incredible influence for good in their lives, or you have it within you through your own neglect to do unspeakable harm. But I'm confident of this. Your influence as men, as husbands and fathers, will not be neutral. But you know, Scripture teaches us the same with respect to women. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their work. If one falls down, his friend can help him up. But pity the man who falls and has no one to help him up. Ecclesiastes 4:9-10. Oh, blessed is the man who has the wife who will help him up, help him along the way. But Proverbs teaches us that a wife's influence will not be neutral either. Proverbs 14:1, the wise woman builds her house, but with her own hands the foolish one tears hers down. See, to the women, wives and mothers, I would say your influence won't be neutral either. You have it within you to be a powerful influence for good, to strengthen him and his influence. Or you have it within you, as Scripture says here, to tear down one's own house. Oh yes, what the church needs, members who are good fathers and mothers, husbands and wives. Hey, if you would, be turning to John chapter 13. We'll be there in just a few moments, but let me say a few more introductory thoughts about marriage and family. If I had it to do over again, I think I could be a better husband. I don't know if I'm the only one or if anybody would want to show hands, but I think if I had it to do over again, I could be a better husband, and I believe if I had it to do over again, I could be a better father. I believe marriage and family life to be a place of spiritual warfare. You don't get married and the devil leaves you alone. You don't bring children into this world and the devil leaves them alone. Marriage and family life is a place of spiritual warfare. And the devil is scheming. And he has a rather simple strategy. You know the strategy. It's not difficult to understand. You separate a husband from his wife and a father from his children, and in the resulting turmoil, you undermine the faith of everyone involved. It's a rather simple strategy, but it's pretty powerful. Most of us don't have to look too far to see its effectiveness. I like to say we're in a raging battle for the hearts and minds, the character and faith of our children that begins at their cradle and should never end this side of our graves. Will never end this side of my grave. And in a very similar way, we're in a battle for the sanctity of our marriages that begins at the altar, that begins at the I do, and should never end this side of eternity. I believe the goal of marriage is to make a holy life together. God's for happiness, but I would suggest to you that God is far more concerned about your holiness than your happiness. And marriage is God's crucible where we are transformed into a holy and righteous people. Consequently, if marriage and family is a place of spiritual warfare, we need a plan. We need a plan for taking up the battle, for being good and godly men, husbands and fathers, for being good and godly women, wives and mothers. We need a plan to resist the devil's schemes. Now, I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't have time tonight to give you the plan. I need about 5 hours, okay? I've got about 35 minutes. So I can't give you the plan tonight, but as we think about being good husbands and fathers, good wives and mothers, I said, well, let's begin with the basics, something fundamental, a common denominator to all of those relationships, right? And if I only had one lesson to bring, because I don't know if you'll have me back or not, I'd like to talk about love, right? And it's the common denominator in being good and godly men, husbands and fathers. It's the common denominator in being good and godly women, wives and mothers, right, is how we love. And so turn to John chapter 13, one of my favorite passages, and let's look at how Jesus loved. Would it suffice to say there's much more to be said about marriage and about parenting than we can do tonight? But would it suffice for the moment to say we will strengthen our marriages if we learn to love like Jesus loved? That we will strengthen our relationship and our influence in the lives of our children if we learn to love like Jesus loved? Would that be fair to say? So that our time here will be meaningful to what the church needs. Good husbands and fathers, wives and mothers. Look at verse 1. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. Or some renderings would say he now showed them how to love. the full extent of his love. And I would suggest to you, beyond the story of the crucifixion, there is not a more powerful story of love than John chapter 13, at least to me. I'm going to show you how you ought to love one another. Verse 2, the evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Now, I don't know about you, but he says in verse 1 that he was going to show them the full extent of his love. He was going to show them how to love. And then in verse 2, it refers to his being betrayed. I don't know about you, but that's kind of curious to me. Why is it when you introduce the chapter by saying, I'm going to show you how to love, you immediately refer to someone who's going to betray you? Could it be that Jesus, in showing us how to love, is going to teach us how to love the unlovable? Going to teach us how to forgive the unforgivable? I'm often reminded that Jesus was betrayed by those who were supposed to love him the most. Isn't that true? His own people who were supposed to love him the most were the ones who betrayed him and nailed him to a cross. And I'm here to tell you, as Jesus teaches us how to love, I'm here to tell you, some of you in your marriage, it will be your spouse who nails you to a cross. And for some of you as parents, it will be your children who betray you the most, and reject you the most, and disappoint you the most. And so maybe verse 2 is suggesting that Jesus is going to show you how to love the unlovable and forgive the unforgivable. Verse 3. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and he was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. Back up to verse 3. Jesus knew that the Father had put what? All things under his power. Now, I don't know about you, but just as I'm intrigued by verse 2, I'm also intrigued by verse 3. Here it is. Verse 1 says, I'm going to teach you how to love. And then verse 3 refers to his power. Why are we talking about power? I thought we were going to be talking about love. You with me? He says, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power. And I'm going to suggest to you, I'm going to give it a word. I think he's referring to what I call positional power. That in your position, you are in a position of authority and power. And we possess a positional power, that he had come from God and was returning to God. That's positional power. All things have been put under me. Could it be that in understanding his teaching on love, he's going to tell us something about power, because all relationships have power dynamics? Could it be, as Ralph Sampson suggested, that when power becomes the focus of any relationship, husband, wife, parent, child, or among colleagues, love is diminished? When power becomes the focus of any relationship, husband, wife, parent, child, among colleagues, the experience of love is diminished. Let me see if we can put that to the test. I'll ask parents, and maybe you can help me. Guess what parents say when I ask them, as you think about raising your children, and all the years of childhood and raising your children, what period of time, stage of child development, did you feel the least loved by your child? Guess what parents say to me more often than not? Teenagers. Absolutely. Well, guess what? Let's not pick on the teens. I go to the teenagers and I ask them, I'm like, hey, or I ask the college students, back when you were teenagers living at home, when did you feel the least loved by your parents? Guess what they say? Exact same thing. The teen years. What's the central issue between parents and children during those adolescent years? What's the issue? Power. Who's in charge? Who decides? Power. Yes, when power becomes the focus of any relationship, the experience of love will be diminished. Let me ask you this. Have you seen a marriage where the focus was on power? Have you seen a competitive marriage where they do battle over who's in charge, who decides? It gets pretty ugly, doesn't it? The experience of love is diminished. Maybe that's why Jesus is referring to power here, because all relationships have power dynamics, and we're going to have to deal with that if we're going to learn to love like Jesus loved. So let's go on. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Now notice something here. Peter understood positional power. He says, Lord, which means what? Ruler, master, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. At the moment, you don't understand completely, but hey, maybe when you witness my ultimate sacrifice, my ultimate submission, you'll more fully understand, perhaps. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. See, I would suggest to you that Peter understood something about positional power. Lord, ruler, master, are you going to wash my feet? No, you will never wash my feet. It is your right for me to wash your feet, not you wash my feet. See, Peter understood positional power, someone that's in authority over. It's your right for me to wash your feet, not you to wash my feet. Watch Jesus, what he says here. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Now, I don't know about you, if you've paid much attention to that verse before, but to me it's one of the most powerful verses in Scripture. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part of me. Jesus is saying, Peter, unless you understand what I'm teaching you in the moment, you have no part with me. Unless you embrace what I'm teaching you in the moment, you have no part with me. Don't even claim to be my disciple. I suggest to you that Jesus is teaching them a different kind of power. It's what I would call a personal power. The power to establish meaningful relationships. The power to capture the heart of your wife, of your husband. The power to capture the heart of your children in such a way that would allow you to influence their lives. He's teaching them a different kind of power. It's a personal power. And we would attach different attributes or adjectives to describe this kind of power. Tenderness, sensitivity, nurturing, being vulnerable, being sacrificial. It's a different kind of power, and he makes a very strong statement, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Unless you understand what I'm teaching you in the moment, unless you embrace and manifest what I'm showing you in the moment, don't even claim to be my disciple. Don't even call yourself a Christian. It's the way I read that. Then Lord Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Jesus answered, a person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. You are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him. And that is why he said not every one was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Jesus knew who he was. He knew his positional authority. I'm teacher, I'm Lord. I know that. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. Oh, a different kind of power. The power to capture the heart of another in such a way that allows you to influence their lives. Yes, we will have stronger marriages when we learn to love like Jesus loved. We will have stronger marriages when we learn to sacrifice like Jesus sacrificed. We'll have stronger marriages when we learn to yield and submit and give in like Jesus yielded and submitted and gave in for us. When we learn to love as Jesus loved. I don't know who taught you how to love. Maybe you could help me. Who taught you how to love? Anybody? I mean, this would be a good time to honor someone who taught you how to love. Anybody? Mother and father is the most common response. Anybody else? Who? Good mother-in-law taught you how to love. Husband taught me how to love. Oh, that's what verse 1 says. Jesus is going to teach them how to love. I don't know who taught you how to love, but I'd like to tell you about the person who taught me how to love. It was my mother. Her epitaph reads, she taught us that which is above all things, to love. For this we honor her 5 sons. She taught us that which is above all things, to love. For this we honor her 5 sons. The strange thing about the book of love that my mother wrote upon my heart is that the final chapter was not written until 2 days after she died. Isn't that intriguing? The conclusion was not written until 2 days after she passed away. Now, I don't know if you think in terms of God making an indelible imprint on your heart, but at least for me, my mother made an indelible imprint on my heart in teaching me how to love. The story goes like this. My father had died in one of my years before, and one of my regrets was that I was not able to be there when he passed away. So I was determined to be there when my mother passed from this life. And so we got a phone call on Wednesday evening, and it said Mom had entered the hospital and the doctors were saying she was not going home this time. She had emphysema, and you need to come. And this was like Wednesday night. So Thursday morning, we're in Abilene, Texas, and Wanda and I get in the car, and our children are off to school, and we drive to Dallas-Fort Worth International, and I met my brother Ron at the airport, and we're going to fly to Mississippi and see Mom as she's in the hospital. And as we are standing there waiting to board our plane, I get a phone call from one of my older brothers who literally read to me Mom's vitals as she passed from this life. And we were standing there in DFW. My mother passed away. We were not able to be there. Now, we're in Dallas. Our children are in Abilene. Wanda has already driven 3 hours to take me to the airport. So she turns around, heads back to Abilene, which would give her about 6 hours of driving on that Thursday, right? And I remain in Dallas to wait to hear about arrangements from my older brothers. And so I talked to them on the phone, and I'm like, hey, look, Wanda's headed back to Abilene. We got to get children out of school and such, and we got a 13-hour drive to Mississippi. It would really be helpful if the wake visitation was on Saturday, maybe the funeral on Sunday or something like that. But we don't need it to be Friday. It's just going to be hard for us to be there. And so they told me to wait there, and they would let us know the arrangements. And later that afternoon, we get a phone call, and my brother, older brother, Jerry, says, Steve, the wake, the visitation is going to be Friday, like at 6 o'clock, and the funeral will be Saturday morning, like 11 o'clock. Now, I don't know about you. I don't think I get angry very easily, but in that moment, I was pretty angry. I had made a request. It's going to be difficult for us to be there for Friday. Wanda's headed back to Abilene. We got a 13. Well, he goes on to explain that, hey, there are nieces and nephews and grandchildren who will be coming to the funeral, and they will need Sunday to drive back home to be at their jobs on Monday. Well, I knew most of those folks, and they had about a 4-hour drive, maybe max 6-hour drive, and we're sitting 13 hours away in Abilene. Now, did I mention that I don't anger very easily? But I was angry. I couldn't help but think, maybe it had something to do, I'm the youngest of 5 boys. Maybe it had something to do with being the low man on the totem pole for all those years, the low man on the corporate flow chart. I couldn't help but think, well, wait a minute, don't I have a vote here? Don't I have a right? Don't I have some say in the plans and the arrangements and such? I didn't say much. Well, not much. But my brother Ron knew I was pretty angry, and Ron was kind of upset too because he had a 9-10-hour drive from Dallas, right? So on Friday morning, Ron and I get up, and individually we take our cars and drive to Mississippi on Friday, and we literally, by ourselves, and we literally arrived 1 hour before the wake, the visitation. And we hurriedly changed clothes, and we went to the wake without our wife and our children. And I was upset. So Saturday morning rolls around for a funeral. Well, our families couldn't make the drive, so what they ended up doing was flying in early Saturday morning and getting there just before the funeral is what we had to do to get the rest of our family there. And so just before going to the funeral, I'm sitting there thinking of some memory that would kind of anchor who my mother was in my life and her influence in my life and what she had taught me in my life. And I'm sitting there literally at a computer trying to think of some description of her, some way to honor her and the person, Christian she was and what she had taught us. And I'm sitting there, and the only thing I could think of was my mother's fried chicken. See, she was a traditional kind of stay-at-home mom with 5 boys, a big family. And the only thing that came to my mind was my mother standing over a hot cook stove preparing meals for her large family. And I literally tried to let go of that memory. I'm like, I've got to come up with something more meaningful. I've got to come up with something that speaks as to who she was and what she taught us and such. And I literally tried to let go of my mother over a hot cook stove and her golden fried chicken, and it would not escape me. That's the only thing I could think of, and I said at some point, well, let's just go with it and see where it takes me. So I started thinking about my mother and how she loved to cook and to prepare for her large family, 5 husbands and 5 boys, right? And how my mother's fried chicken was one of our favorite of her faithfully prepared dishes. And what kind of struck me about, as I remembered this, what kind of struck me was how my mother, who was entitled to the first fruits of her own labor, right, could have first choice, how my mother would always choose drumsticks and thighs. That's what she would eat. And she enjoyed drumsticks and thighs. And I'm like, wouldn't you prefer, the chicken breast or something? But my mother enjoyed the drumsticks and thighs. And so I'm sitting there thinking of how Steve preferred the chicken breast. But so did they. My 4 older brothers. They preferred the chicken breast too. We were all chicken lovers, right? And so I would sit there and think and contemplate how I could get one of those few chicken breasts. But invariably, with much less seniority and a much shorter arm reach, they would get the few chicken breasts and Steve would end up with, guess what? One of the drumsticks and thighs. But guess what? I enjoyed it much less than my mother. Secretly, I looked forward to being home alone. You've watched the movies Home Alone, and I looked forward to the day I would be home alone. And sure enough, that day came when my 4 brothers were out of the house, and I could reach out there and I could choose one of those few chicken breasts for myself. But something really strange happened when that time came. I can distinctly remember my mother reaching out there and taking the other chicken breast. I was literally confused. I'm like, well, what is this that she would take and the chicken breast when she has loved drumsticks and thighs for all these years? I couldn't hardly stand myself. I was beside myself. So finally one day I just asked her, I said, Mom, what are you doing eating a chicken breast when you've enjoyed drumsticks and thighs for all these years? And I can still remember what she said. She looked at me and she said, oh. And she had a way of saying oh that kind of communicated that she knew something you didn't know, or she understood something that you didn't yet understand, you know what I mean? She said, oh, the chicken breast has always been my favorite piece. And so here I am about to go to her funeral, and I begin to think and contemplate the wisdom in my mother's fried chicken, and how in her humble way and quiet way for all these years she had been teaching us that it's more blessed to give than to receive. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. What it means to give up your rights to meet someone else's needs. Oh, I sat there in tears at this point, contemplating the wisdom in my mother's fried chicken. Well, I told you before I was kind of beside myself with anger. Well, guess what? For a second time, I'm beside myself, except this time I'm excited about, I've got a story that honors Mom. You know, and I'm beside myself. I gotta tell my family this story of the wisdom in my mother's fried chicken. So we literally go to the funeral and we go to the cemetery, and the service is concluded, and I'm thinking, I've got to tell my brothers, my family, about the wisdom of our mother's fried chicken. And I go up to my sister-in-law, Mary Dean, and I'm like, Mary Dean, I've got something I want to say to the family. And we were going over to my brother Larry and Mary Dean's house for a meal, and everybody could then get on the road. And I'm like, Mary Dean, I've got something I want to say about Mom, and the only time I can think to do it is right before the prayer. If you would let me have a few moments to talk about Mom. And she's like, oh, okay. And so we go to my in-laws' house, Wanda and I do, to change clothes and go out to the country for our meal together. And we go to their house and we change clothes, and we're headed out to Van Cleve, Mississippi. And I call my sister-in-law and I'm like, Mary Dean, have you got any fried chicken? And oddly enough, she did not. And I'm like, oh, we got to have some fried chicken. You know, I got to have the visual aids. You know, it's a teachable moment. And so we go through a drive-through, and I order a full bucket, watch this, of mixed chicken. See, I needed all the pieces for my illustration, right? I want a full bucket of chicken, mixed, dark meat, white meat. And I go through the drive-through, and we go on out toward the country, and by the time we get out there, I'm getting a little nervous. I'm getting a little anxious. It's taken us some time to change clothes and go through the drive-through and buy the chicken, and my anxiety was that what if they proceed without us? What if they start the meal before we get there? And as we're coming down Wooded Acres Road that has a big curve in it, my brother's house is there, and we come around the curve, and I look over at his house, and I see people scattering out into the yard with plates in hand. And I knew the opportunity was lost to share the wisdom of my mother's fried chicken. I was now beside myself for the third time. But it's back on the anger side. Oh, and I'd already planned that I'm going to write them a letter, my older brother's a letter. When I get back home and things settle down, I'm going to write them a letter about being offended that my voice wasn't listened to, and I wasn't heard, and I should have had a right to express our need and all that. I was going to write them. I'd already planned. That's how I would handle it, is do it in writing. And now for the third time, I was beside myself. And we go inside, and I place this bucket of chicken over on the table, and I'm literally thinking to myself, well, I'm going to be the first in that bucket, I'm getting one of the chicken breasts. You with me? That's kind of where I like, hey, I got some serious medicating to do here. I'm going to at least be the first in there, and I'm going to get one of those chicken breasts, and I will never forget this moment. Probably one of the most meaningful, influential moments of my life. I put the bucket down, and I went over and I got me a plate, and I walked over, and I took the lid off, and I go to reach in and get one of those few chicken breasts. And I promise you, the only pieces of chicken in the bucket were drumsticks and thighs. And it deserves a chuckle from you. But for me, in that moment, it was like I could hear my mother's voice saying, Steve, son, don't you yet understand the wisdom in your mother's fried chicken? Don't you yet understand that it's more blessed to give than to receive? Don't you yet understand what it means to do unto others as you would have them do unto you? And what it means to give up your rights to meet someone else's needs. And it was like in this moment, I could hear Jesus saying, Steve, don't you yet understand what it means to wash feet? Don't you yet understand what it means to take up your cross daily and follow me? And I began to contemplate what those older brothers needed. They had cared for my mother in her emphysema for the last 4 or 5 years of her life. My brother Larry says there were moments where she could not catch her next breath, and all he could do was hold her hand while she turned blue. But at least he was there to hold her hand. And my brother Jerry, who typically worked 60 hours a week kind of job, would tell me the stories of him being up 2 and 3 times at night with mother being in distress. They were there. And I began to think about, well, what did they need in this moment? Their lives haven't been normal in 4 or 5 years. Maybe they needed to get the crowd fed and on the road and begin to kind of put their lives back in order or something. I started thinking about that. What did they need? What it means to give up your rights. What does sacrificial love look like? You say, well, what'd you do with all that anger? What about writing that letter? Did you write that letter? I decided that I would embrace the wisdom of my mother's fried chicken, that I would try to love more like Jesus loved and wash one another's feet. And the next day, as we were about to head back to Texas, I went to my 2 older brothers and their wives who had cared for Mom faithfully for years. And I said, thank you for taking care of Mom for all these years. And I said, no more. The wisdom of my mother's fried chicken. Oh, we'll have stronger marriages, won't we? When we learn to love as Jesus loved. We'll have stronger relationships with our children when we learn to love as Jesus loved. When we can capture the hearts of our wife and children, when we can capture the hearts of our husband and child, we'll have stronger marriages. We'll have stronger families. Amen? The lesson is yours. There's an invitation song. If there's some way we can pray for you or serve you this evening, we want to make that opportunity available to you. David's going to lead us in that song, I think. Thank you, David. If there's some way we can meet your needs, please come while we